Alright, next we have the Townshend Acts. And these acts were actually created or led by Charles Townshend, who believed that the colonists had bad behavior. Charles Townshend was actually a member of the British Parliament who had the nickname of Champagne Charlie because of his habit of making speeches in Parliament after drinking champagne. And he did not think kindly of the colonists at all. And he actually wanted to keep an army in the British colonies and make the colonists pay for that army. Obviously, the colonists thought differently here. Okay, anyways, he made a speech to Parliament in 1767. He actually persuaded Parliament to pass what was called the Townshend Acts, named after him, obviously. This tax placed a certain tax on goods imported from Britain. This included glass, paint, paper, and tea. Obviously, the colonists thought these were very unacceptable. And as you can see here, this is how the colonists kind of found out about these taxes. There's the British Army over here. And here's a colonist kind of reading the poster and the ad saying, here's a tax on all of these things now. So you can imagine how mad the colonists would be just seeing these things posted all over their towns. Obviously, there was some backlash against the Townshend Acts, and Samuel Adams led the charge against these acts. He wrote a letter to every colony that protested the Townshend Acts, and this was posted on store walls, building walls, just like you kind of saw in that picture, so everyone in the town could read it. And this letter argued that this truly violated their rights as British citizens. And remember, they thought of themselves as British citizens. Therefore, Sam Adams kind of created this big rally, this big charge, and the people actually in the colonies decided to boycott all British goods, especially the ones with taxes on them. Women especially helped this boycott by making their own clothing, brewing their own tea, and buying American-made goods only. And this was a boycott. They were not going to buy any English goods at all. They were going to fend for themselves, and they were going to kind of show the British a little lesson. And then here is actually Sam Adams. He's going to be a pretty integral figure in the American independence and kind of leading that way. Obviously, he was a devout patriot, and he believed that America should be independent. During this boycott, Lord North became head of the British government, and he could see that the Townshend Acts were losing a lot of money, and it wasn't helping out the cause at all. And remember, the British government desperately needed this money after the debt that they were in. So he convinced Parliament to actually repeal the Townshend Act tax on all goods except for tea. Many members of Parliament, after seeing this boycott, were actually troubled by this, and they thought all tax, including the tax on tea, should be taken away from the colonists, because this was just going to keep asking for more and more trouble from the colonists, and they knew that taxes were not going to work. Here is the man, the myth, the legend, Lord North, who wanted to repeal these Townshend Acts because of the American boycott. Okay, now on the same day the Townshend Acts were repealed, a fight broke out between the colonists and the British soldiers. We know that prior to this fight, trouble had been brewing in the colonies for months, especially in big cities like Boston. Boston patriots were becoming very big troublemakers in the colonies and in the larger cities. And we know that these British troops were sent here to kind of keep control and make sure nothing happened. Well, when you have troops in an area and a lot of people don't believe there should be troops there, not really good things happen. So the patriots really resented these British troops being in their town, being in their city, and they didn't think that they needed them. They thought they were being kind of micromanaged by the British government. Still, this being said, the British troops did not have an order to fire on the patriots or any Boston citizens at all. Their job was strictly there to be present and active in the community. To kind of help you give a picture of maybe what these troops and the regular colonists look like during this time, this would be considered possibly a British patriot, and this is how they would dress. This is how they would go around town on an everyday basis. And then the British troops looked like this. So the British troops were kind of clashing with the patriots here. Alright, so on March 5th, 1770, this noisy mob of patriots began to throw rocks and ice balls at troops guarding the Boston Customs House. The mob eventually began to get worse and worse, and a soldier was even knocked down to the ground. So you can imagine, maybe you've seen protests on TV. This was an angry mob they were getting out of control, and they were actually attacking the British troops. And you've seen this on TV today, unfortunately, with kind of the mob violence that happens in some communities. So out of panic, a British soldier actually opened fire on the citizens. And one of the shots actually hit a freed black man by the name of Crispus Attucks, and he was a freed slave. He was the first one who died, but unfortunately there was a total of 5 people killed and 6 others that were injured because of this fire that the British troops opened upon the citizens. Maybe you have seen this depiction before, but this is actually an illustration created by a man of the name Paul Revere. You've probably heard of the name Paul Revere before. He actually was convinced to do this illustration about just a couple days after the attacks. And you can see the big patriot viewpoint from this position. It almost looks like the British troops are all ordered to fire, and obviously there's some gruesome pictures of some men laying on the ground with blood coming out of their heads and that sort of thing. So it's kind of a myth, but this wasn't known as the Boston Massacre until about 2-3 years after, in 1770, and this was mainly to create anti-British sentiment in the colonies. Obviously, they wanted to get people against the British troops and against just Great Britain in general, and this was a kind of huge feeling to spark that. So once again, Sam Adams was kind of at the lead of this, and he saw this incident as a great opportunity to whip up some anti-British feeling. Just weeks after the incident, he called the riot a horrid massacre. And like you saw back there, he had Paul Revere engraved soldiers firing at peaceful, unarmed citizens. You see this is almost kind of like a little biased perspective here. Obviously, this was a horrid incident, but it never really gave the side of the British troops. This was the British troops attacking peaceful, unarmed citizens, shooting them unwillingly, without warning, that sort of thing. So you can see the colonists became fairly upset about this. And the Patriots really wanted to push the British to remove all troops. This was their goal here. But in turn, Loyalists, who were for the British government, they saw this as more proof than ever that the troops were needed in the colonies because of kind of the unrest and the mob violence that was occurring, especially in Boston. So in the end, yes, the Boston Massacre was a horrid incident, but it didn't spark any new protests against British rule. It created this anti-British feeling, but it didn't really start until like years after. Obviously, some patriots especially were outraged by this and saw this as an attack on citizens, but others saw this as kind of a two-way deal, that the patriots weren't really acting accordingly and the troops weren't acting accordingly. So even though this was a horrid incident in which people died, it didn't just kind of spark everything. It took a while for this tension to kind of build up, and that's important to understand.